Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, it's election night, of course, with a lot at stake, including the governor's race and the 3 statewide proposals on the ballot on term limits, voting rights, and abortion rights, plus reports of election workers and political candidates targeted for harassment and intimidation. We have expert analysis from Ryan Petersen, a political science professor here at Delta College, and Sue Smith from the Michigan League of Women Voters. But first, we have viewer feedback from our most recent show on Proposal 3, the Right to Reproductive Freedom Act on abortion rights. These comments came from YouTube. Here's what Raymond Bryant said: "It's too extreme and too permanent. Last line is too dangerous." Next up, we have K Carr. "It's confusing, so just vote no. Tell me your voters are dumb without telling me your voters are dumb." Next up, this viewer writes, "No, no. 3, stop the murder." Next up, "I just voted yes because the absolute right to bodily autonomy supersedes any potential shortcomings of this proposal. Too extreme, too confusing is merely a disingenuous marketing slogan. Let's be honest, if the proposal was simply abortion is legal, the same people would still be against it." Next up, "Would be great if they just got a neutral guest to explain the proposal to people, someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight." And lastly, "That's like saying there is a neutral position on whether the earth is flat or not. If you have a body and are human, you have a stake in this fight." Well, there you go. Thanks for your comments, much appreciated. And we'd like to hear from more of you to help drive the conversation here on the follow-up. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media on Facebook and Twitter. You can email us, or you can dial into our follow-up hotline to offer your opinion or suggest future show topics. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows this season, just log on to deltapublicmedia.org. Well, on for tonight's show, we have Ryan Petersen, political science professor from Delta College, in the studio with me. He's a regular. Nice to have you back, Ryan.
Great to be back. Thank you.
And we have Sue Smith dialing in from Ypsilanti. She is with the Michigan League of Women Voters and a prior president, too. So thanks for dialing in today, Sue.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Mike.
So let's start with this. There seems to be a cloud hanging over these midterms, locally and nationally. Has to do with the divisiveness that's kind of carried over from the January 6th insurrection a couple years back now. Obviously fueled by former President Trump, who didn't concede the election. He and his supporters continue to question the outcome of the election. Election deniers, as they're calling it, conspiracy theories are running rampant, and you have extremists on both sides threatening and harassing candidates and election workers. So Ryan, I'm going to start with you, okay, and maybe Sue can follow up. A couple of questions. What are your initial thoughts on sort of the current climate? Yeah. How did we get here, and what impact do you think it might have on the current elections?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're obviously at an incredibly divisive time in American politics. We are very closely divided and very deeply divided, and that's a scary, dangerous place to be. It's not the first time in American political history that we've found ourselves at this point. In fact, I was talking to students today about the election of 1800, which in many ways actually looked quite similar to this. But as you mentioned, I mean, there's a real problem. As I was on my way out the door to the studio, I saw an exit poll, and I don't know, I'm assuming this was specific to a particular state, but it's probably similar in other places. And it was a little over 30% of voters thought that Joe Biden had not legitimately won the last presidential election. And that's a real problem in a representative democracy if you have nearly a third of people doubting the integrity of elections. It's again, you know, I think of Benjamin Franklin's words, you know, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. That's really problematic if one side believes the only possible outcomes are that they win or it's the result of fraud that they've lost. How you maintain a representative democracy going forward, I don't know. And I don't know how you change that either.
Right. It's not just mistrust of the election process. I think it's a mistrust of sort of the government. I mean, you brought up 1800. I mean, I
Yeah.
could go back to say, well, Watergate is when
Right.
it really started going. So, Sue, what's your take on this climate, and where do we go from here, and how did we get here? I guess.
Well, I think it's really unfortunate that so many people have been misled by people they trust into thinking that um, they can't trust the system. What we have learned at the league, I think, over the years is that democracy is something that everybody has to care about and work at. And I think a lot of us, for a number of years, were pretty complacent. We just assumed that everything would go along fine because it had gone along fine. And we didn't pay enough attention to what was actually happening. And I think now we are learning that we have to care, we have to pay attention to what's happening and make sure that um, our democratic institutions continue to thrive. And that requires participation. People can't just sit back and not vote or not participate in civic engagement and expect that somebody else will take care of it and everything will be fine.
Right.
So I hope we've all learned that lesson and that more of us will become engaged in what's happening.
Yeah, rightly so. And by the looks of it going in, we may see a record turnout for a midterm. The 2020 election was, I think, a near record, if not a record, for a presidential election in 2020. We may be in the midterms may have record turnout, so there's more people participating.
There's certainly a sense, I think, nowadays that elections matter. I can remember when I started my teaching career, this was right around the time we had all-time lows. 1996, the presidential election voter turnout fell down to 49%. I think the sense with a lot of my students was that voting really didn't matter. It didn't make a difference one way or the other. I guess if there is a silver lining in this at all, it's that nobody says that to me anymore. Nobody suggests that voting doesn't matter or that there won't be any difference if a particular candidate or a particular party wins the election. I think everybody sees that now.
Well, it's interesting, and I like you both touch on this, the younger vote, right? So Ryan, in your classes, you're talking about, it seems like they're into it. They're also a little bit anxious. This is their first opportunity. Question is, do you think they'll vote? And then Sue, you can answer that. I'd like you to comment to that as well after Ryan, because I know the league is very active in advocacy on college campuses. So Ryan, how are they reacting?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think on the one hand, my students seem to be less comfortable talking about politics than for most of my teaching career. There's a fear there because things are so divisive that they're not really comfortable expressing their opinions publicly in the way that they used to be. That said, I think it's probably more likely that they're going to vote than has been the case in the past. And interestingly, when you combine those two things, how they're going to vote is a really big question mark then, because they're not talking about it, they're not necessarily giving any indication of which way they're leaning, what they're thinking. Again, maybe a little hesitation to even talk about that, but then they're going to show up and vote. And that's one of many reasons that I think makes this election virtually impossible to predict in terms of forecasting outcomes.
Well, it's a huge bloating block, not only now, but in the future as they grow up, get older, and start voting a lot more regularly. So Sue, I know at the league, you guys are advocate for young voters. I think you're visiting college campuses and making some presentation. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, of course, we've been working with colleges and high schools to get students registered to vote. If you can get people to register to vote fairly early in their life when they're eligible at 18, they're of course much more likely to participate. So that's a very important first step. And I know the colleges have been reaching out too, trying to encourage their students to get engaged and to vote. I was up at Central Michigan University where I used to teach a couple of weeks ago and talking with students who wanted to find out more about the ballot proposals and what were the advantages and the disadvantages, the pros and cons of each of the three ballot proposals. And Central has made a real effort to get students engaged and to ensure that they actually vote. So I think that's a very hopeful sign. But it has to be, they have to see the link between voting and their lives. And if they think it doesn't matter and or who they vote for or doesn't going to affect their daily life, then of course they're not going to get engaged. So it's really important for fellow students to get out there and talk about why it's important for them to vote, how it will affect them.
That's very important. I'm going to stay with you on this issue since we've been talking about election deniers and mistrust of the election process, because another area where your league is doing some good work is respect to election protection, both in terms of ensuring a fair election and protecting workers and candidates for that matter from harassment and intimidation. Can you talk about that part of what you're doing?
Yes, we are part of a coalition of about 30 organizations in the state who are part of this very robust election protection program. We have had a hotline out there for a number of weeks that people could call if they had questions, and also encouraging people if they run into a problem at the polls when they go to vote, if they think that they're challenged inappropriately or if they're not being treated correctly or somebody's not following the rules, they can call this hotline and talk with somebody not only in English but also Arabic or Spanish um, to get help in resolving the problem. And these phones are manned or womaned by the lawyers committee, so they're very helpful in resolving issues. So far, I haven't been aware that there have been extensive problems at the polls, and that is good news.
Yeah, it seems like it's running smooth for the most part. Ryan, I'm going to come to you because it's not just these extremists that are election deniers and fueling this mistrust. There are a lot of candidates themselves, both nationally and locally, that are buying into these conspiracy theories. And I think it's no secret that Petersen, who's the GOP incumbent running against Governor Whitmer, has sort of bought into that as a Trump supporter. I think she's toned that down a bit in the last few weeks. So that's certainly affecting the election process too.
Yeah, although maybe not. Well, I don't. Not in the way that people necessarily think. And I think to back up a little bit, have they bought into this, or are they viewing this as something that is going to result in short-term electoral gain for them? I think there are a lot of cynical people out there who don't believe this themselves, but they're willing to sell this or jump on the bandwagon because they perceive it's going to win them in an election. And in the case of the primaries, it did. But I think all things being equal, if this was a normal year, you would expect the president's party to lose seats in Congress. You would expect maybe to a lesser extent to see them lose some ground in terms of state and local elections. With the economy where it's at, with inflation, with gas prices, with the president's approval rating, you would expect the other party to sweep a midterm election like this. And I don't think they're going to. I don't think Republicans are going to sweep. Now, they may end up taking control of the House and Senate. They may well win some of these statewide races. Again, we're a very closely divided country right now. But I think because you had such extreme candidates nominated, that what should be easy wins for the Republicans, that what with more mainstream Republican candidates would be easy wins in an election year like this, I don't think you're going to see them winning anywhere near as much of a majority, if they get a majority in either houses, as would have otherwise been the case.
It's interesting. I read a headline this afternoon that came over the Free Press, and I think the reporter called it, at least early on, looks like a red mirage was the term, meaning at least early on, based on the amount of people that were coming in person to vote today, based on the polling, it seemed like the Republicans were doing okay.
Right.
But then if you recall from the 2020 election, that was the case with Trump. That evening on election night, it looked like he was doing well, and all of a sudden all these absentee ballots started coming in for Biden, and that's where the Republicans started questioning the absentee ballots.
Right, and I mean, we've had suspicion raised about what are like perfectly mundane things that we all know happen. That if you start counting votes in smaller, more rural districts first, things are going to lean towards the Republican in a statewide race. And then if you have a larger precinct in a big city, that's going to take longer to count things are going to potentially shift back the other way. And this happens in both directions. I just saw somebody talking about the fact that in the last presidential election, you know, this happened. It was sort of a red mirage, right, shifting blue in Pennsylvania. But at the same time in Ohio, it's doing the exact opposite. It's going the other direction. Again, these are, you know, it doesn't matter what order the votes are counted in. As long as all the votes are counted, that's the count, that's the result. But people have cast suspicion, you know, over this, as though this is something suspicious or unexpected. This is a perfectly normal occurrence in an election.
Well, it's interesting, too. We're so impatient. And Sue, I'm going to give you a chance in a moment, because it used to be we got results by the 11 o'clock news and you put it to bed. That's really not the case anymore, and I think there is additional suspicion. The longer it goes, not only is it going to be the next morning, it could be days, it could be weeks, and then you're going to maybe see legal challenges. But Sue, talk a little bit about absentee balloting. We're getting a record number of folks voting absentee, which I think is a good thing, because I think more people are involved in the process. And yet it seems like, from the numbers, that more Democrats tend to vote absentee, more Republicans tend to vote in person. Can you make heads or tails of why that's the case? And that wasn't always the case, right, in your experience?
Right. You might remember that in 2018, the voters in Michigan decided to make it easier to vote absentee by removing the requirement that you had to be 60 or older, or you had to have some kind of a disability, you're going to be out of town. It was much more difficult to vote absentee than it has been since the amendment to the Constitution was passed in 2018 that made it possible for all eligible voters to vote absentee if they chose to. And so a lot more people did, especially in 2020. People were concerned about COVID, for example. But even now this year, we're finding that people are continuing to vote absentee. Certainly in the primary, more than half of the people who voted absentee. And we don't know the exact numbers yet, of course, but the predictions are that that's going to hold true. And as you say, it allows for delays in counting the ballots. It takes longer to close it, to count the absentee ballots. They can't start until 8 o'clock on election night. And so those results are going to be slower in coming, which of course just adds to the suspicions that some people have about whether these are really legitimate votes that are coming in later. You know, in Michigan, another factor that'll be interesting to watch is what effect the new maps have, because we had maps drawn by an independent redistricting commission this time that are being used for the first time for this 2022 election. And up until now, the maps have always been drawn by the legislature, and whoever was in power in the legislature, whether it was the Democrats or the Republicans, they drew the lines that would help to ensure they got reelected. So that isn't the case this time, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what impact that's going to have on the election in terms of the congressional delegation, for example, as well as the State House and State Senate.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, and Ryan, I'll let you follow up on that, because that's really an important issue. And just this week, I think it might have been today, the U.S. Supreme Court did rule in favor of those maps going forward. There were a number of appeals, and so whatever happens in this election, those maps are good to go. Ryan?
Yeah, and we have some competitive districts now, and this is going to work potentially in both directions. I myself live in two districts that were formerly not really competitive that now are. The state Senate district I'm in is no longer going to be a shoo-in for the Republican. I'm actually now in a different congressional district, and that is not going to be a shoo-in for the Democrats. So this is working in both directions. But this is, in a healthy democracy, this is what you want to see. You want to see healthy competitive districts where a candidate from either party has a chance of potentially winning. And that's, I think, what we've got now. So,
well, be careful what you wish for. And Sue, you can talk to us about the process, how we got to this point, because I think the league was out front in terms of creating this citizens panel redistricting commission, right? And a lot of people said, hey, that's a great idea. Let the citizens work this process, and now once they did the maps, it's like, well, wait a minute, that's not what we expected, right? But you're still a fan of it, and you kind of led that effort, right?
Well, the league wasn't the only organization that was involved. We certainly got involved right away when the legislature adopted the gerrymandered maps back in 2011. Um, and we did a lot of town halls and trying to educate people about redistricting. We did a study to find out how other states did redistricting and concluded that an independent citizens redistricting commission was the best way to ensure that we had fair maps that would serve the people in the state of Michigan. And so we worked for that over a number of years. And in 2018, other people also got on board. Voters Not Politicians was very involved in that as well. And we ended up with a proposal on the ballot in 2018 that created the redistricting commission. The league has been observing those meetings and continues to do so since September of 2020, and following along to see what happens now that they're using the new maps and what the future is going to hold. And as you mentioned, Mike, the U.S. Supreme Court did dismiss the Banarian case yesterday, which was the one that was challenging the congressional districts. So there's just one federal court case left, and it's in the Western District of the federal courts, and we'll see what happens on that one. But so far, of course, there may be more challenges after this election. When people see how it turns out, there may be more lawsuits.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, the Voters Not Politicians group, we've had them on a number of times. We had them on the gerrymandering issue back in 2018, and we just had them on again on the voting rights proposal too, just a couple weeks ago. So we're on top of it as well, and they've been very successful in getting the signatures and getting people out to vote, and they've been getting these passed. So it's interesting. Let me just change gears. We haven't talked a lot on the show at the moment about specific issues. Driving voters to the polls here in Michigan, impacting decision making in Michigan because of this abortion rights issue. It's getting a lot of attention. Certainly the governor's race, at least early on, every ad you saw was Dixon versus Whitmer because they have varying views on that issue. With Proposal 3 in other states, that's not so much the case. Economy, inflation, education, crime are bigger elsewhere. So how do you see these issues playing out in Michigan?
Yeah, this is part of the complexity. I mean, I primarily focus on American national politics. This is one of those complexities that makes this an incredibly difficult election to forecast because, as you said, the abortion question is literally on the ballot in Michigan. This is something that is presumably going to drive some turnout. Quite possibly on both sides, right? It's not clear if this is going to favor one side or the other. In other states, it's not on the ballot, and the issue itself is short of an attempt to impose a federal ban. It's all but settled. Either it's already codified in state law or the state constitution as a right, or it's banned, and the political leanings in that state essentially make that very difficult to overturn. So, yeah, I mean, in Michigan it could be huge, and I think you could potentially see a lot of suburban voters, in particular suburban women, turning out as a result of this, and that could very well then end up affecting the races because you've got a different sort of turnout, right, taking place than otherwise would have been the case had this Supreme Court ruling not come down.
So, Sue, what do you think? Is abortion really what's driving people? Some would say it's usually about pocketbook issues, and we're at a 40-year high with inflation. People in my circles, to be quite honest, they're saying that's what's driving them to the polls, that's driving their decision making. Sue, what are you hearing on the street and with your experience?
I think it depends on who you talk to. I mean, certain populations are more concerned about the economy and inflation and so forth, but there certainly is a large segment of the population that is very concerned about abortion, and younger women, suburban women, a lot of women, period, are very concerned about this issue, either one way or the other. And so I think it has certainly, I think we will find out, has driven a lot of people to the polls, and it's yet to be determined how that is going to turn out. Uh, and then, of course, we have two other ballot proposals also, the voting rights proposal and the term limits proposal. So it'll be interesting to see if the voting rights proposal passes, proposal two. It will make voting a lot more convenient and secure here in Michigan. So the league has worked hard on that particular proposal to get that passed. So we're hopeful that that will happen.
Yeah, I think the downside of that some people see, and I would agree, in the long term or even the short term, it might allow for more folks to vote. Talking to local county clerks, they're going to have to add staff. You're going to have not election boxes, but boxes out in the community. There's a cost to that. That's sort of the cons on that, Sue, a little bit. It's going to cost taxpayers a little bit more to do that extra work, right?
Well, making it possible for more people to exercise their right to vote is worth the cost. And the legislature will have to come up with more money for local governments. That's a big issue that has gone for a number of years, where they have cut back on the amount of money they've given to local governments to not only run elections, but provide other kinds of services as well. So I just see the state is going to have to step up and do their job.
Okay. Hey, Ryan, I'm going to go with you on this next question. With the Biden administration not having a good couple of years, if the House or the Senate or both turn in the favor of the GOP, is this a referendum on the Biden administration? What does that mean for the next 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, is a midterm election a referendum on the president? For some voters, yes. Again, if you look at the polling, probably a majority of voters, though, are not really voting to reward or punish a president in an election like this. Candidates still matter, issues still matter, party still matters. All of those things are factors, and I don't think most voters are primarily voting for candidates or for ballot measures based on the president's performance. Now, in terms of impact, again, there's a good chance that Republicans are at least going to retake control of the House, and so all I can say is buckle up, because this is going to change the dynamic in Washington tremendously. We'll be back to divided party control. You've got members of the Republican conference in the House who said they want to impeach Biden. Certainly, I think we're going to see investigations opening up. Obviously, any chance of getting a legislative agenda through is going to be pretty much done at that point for the administration. So it's going to be back to gridlock, stalemate, name-calling investigations. The list goes on and on.
Yeah, Sue, we got about another minute. Maybe follow up with that. Ryan used the term gridlock. They're not listening to the constituents out there, because I think no matter who's in charge, it just seems like it's a bit of a mess and nobody can get along, and we have a hard time getting things done, and we hope and pray at some point we can disagree, but we've got to get something done in this country, right?
I guess I have hope, because the younger generation doesn't like all this bickering and divisiveness, and they're more interested in working together. So I'm hoping as the years go along, that we will get through this particular point in our history where we're so politically divided and can find ways to get things done that need to be done for the people in this country.
Well, that's what, Ryan, what you said at the beginning of the show with your students. They're anxious, they don't like the divisiveness, and we hope that can turn the corner. So I've been hearing the term democracy on the ballot. I've been hearing about that, but remains to see the outcomes, and we'll know in the next day or two, I'm sure. Sue Smith with the League of Women Voters here in Michigan, thank you for dialing in tonight. Ryan Petersen with Delta College, as usual, great having you in as well. So, And that's our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next week for the follow-up. If Proposal 2 passes, the voting rights proposal, what does it mean to you and what does it mean for local clerks? Saginaw County Clerk Vanessa Guerra will be here with her perspective. We now join the PBS National Elector coverage right now.